what I would like to do today is try to categorize and parse out and think through everything we've done up to this point using this chart that I thought of about 10 minutes ago, and then look at the last two figures, Martin Buber and Yeshua Leibovitz. And I've also handed out a few pages from a contemporary book. There's a wonderful Hebrew study by a Hebrew University professor, Aviezer Ravitsky, in Hebrew with an English summary at the end, just 2 pages, 3 pages. So I've handed out the English summary. There aren't enough to go around, but if we get to it, then you can share it. Okay, so let me go over some of the ground that we've covered and try to make sense of it better in retrospect. The argument of the course has been that in thinking about the relationship of Judaism to politics, we're thinking about the very central, essential nature of Judaism. This is not a subfield, interesting as it might be, like Judaism in art or Judaism in music. It really goes to how Jews think about their tradition and what shapes that thought on the most basic level. So I think in the history of Jewish thinking about Torah, about Judaism, there have been 2 conceptions or 2 traditions. One is to think that Torah is a comprehensive order that covers all of life. And part of that order is how we live together in the most organized fashion, that is, in a political way. So we have a political conception of Judaism. There are variations in how that politics is formulated or expressed or what is thought to be ideal, but basically there's a political conception of Judaism. I think this is the main conception that Jews have had throughout the centuries, that Judaism is, the Torah is basically a politeia, a constitution in the ancient sense that describes both a total way of life and a framework of government of how people should live together. Ancient authors who are Greek-speaking, like Philo and Josephus, they use this term very naturally. They describe Judaism as a politeia, as a political community, but I think the thought is there in the Bible, in the notion of covenant, brit, which we talked about. I would say the anti-political conception of Judaism, the idea that the best category in which to put Torah is something called religion. And the Jewish version of religion is similar to the Christian version of religion, to the Buddhist version of religion, that sort of thing. This is basically a modern idea. So, thinking back on the figures whom we've considered, I think that the great exponent, the great example, exemplar of the anti-political view is Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn, because he's on the edge of Western modernity, is working very hard to make Judaism into something that the German Protestants can recognize as a religion, and then making the argument that all religions should be treated equally in an enlightened modern state. I think Mendelssohn is a dramatic break from the prior history of thinking of Judaism in some broad political framework. After Mendelssohn, we saw another modern figure from the last century, Franz Rosenzweig, who has an even more dramatically anti-political conception of Judaism, the Jewish people. We skipped 2 centuries here, or one full century, the 19th century. I could put a lot of other thinkers, modern thinkers, in between Mendelssohn and Rosenzweig, but the main point that I want to make is that the anti-political conception is a product of the modern Jewish situation. A thinker we'll get to later today, but he should be up here at this point. He just died a few years ago. Here's a man named Yeshayahu Leibovitz. We'll have a little reading by him, and we'll talk about him in just a while. Now, getting over to what I'm claiming and what my colleague at Hebrew University, Aviesa Ravitsky, is claiming, is that Judaism is predominantly over the millennia, a way for a community, a nation, a people to live together, ideally under its own law and its own territory, with its own governmental institutions that are grounded, based in its Torah. So this political conception is predominant. Of the thinkers that we've studied or will look at today, how do they fall out? Well, under monarchy, what is the worst M? What do we have to do? We could put Maimonides here. His very strong political reading of what the Torah is, his great code that covers all of Jewish law, culminates in the book called Kings and Their Wars. You can't get more political than that. So for Maimonides, the normative shape of Judaism is a restored Davidic monarchy with the Jews settled securely in the land of Israel, able to defend themselves, the temple rebuilt, the sacrificial system in full play, and God and Israel coming close together once again. It's a great political whole. The farthest, so to have monarchy is to have a strong centralization of power. It's to have a fully empowered political realm for monarchists like Maimonides, the Rambam, Rabbi Nissim Garandi, lots of other medieval figures who opt for monarchy. They all tend to say that the Torah's trajectory, the Torah's aim, is for there to be a king. We saw this is controversial within the Torah, but as they read it, it's for there to be a king. But there's an argument within or among the monarchists of how far the king's power goes. Is the king bound by the Torah? Does the king get to do things that go far beyond the Torah? Does the king have emergency powers where he can overturn the Torah? And for many monarchists, like Maimonides and Garandi, the Ran he's called, the king can overturn the Torah. That's how political they are. This later figure, after Maimonides, he's called the Ran. A lot of the medieval Jewish figures, they have abbreviations as names, beginning with R for rabbi. So this is Rabbi Nissim, the Ran. So the Ran comes out and says that if you tried to run a state according to the Torah, you would not succeed, because the Torah is the constitution of an ideal state for Messianic times. And we don't live in an ideal state. So in fact, the king has to do all kinds of things that aren't in the Torah. It's very difficult, according to the Torah, to put someone to death, a criminal. It's very difficult to get a death penalty. The Torah allows for a death penalty, but as the rabbis interpret it, you need so much evidence, there are so many conditions necessary to convict someone, it really can't be done. So both Maimonides and Iran say that the king has the power to intervene and put to death whomever he thinks deserves death, even if the evidence is not there to fully convict him before a Jewish court. So that's a very strong political conception. So at the far other end of this is a figure we'll look at today, Martin Buber. Martin Buber's view is Jews are a political people. They always were. The Torah is a social political document. It aims to help people to live together in the best, most just way possible. But what is the best, most just way possible? Buber is basically an anarchist. Don't think communist anarchist, just pure anarchist. That means the fewer laws, the less power, the better. Buber believes that human beings can spontaneously come together in societies where they're small, they're village-based, they learn to live together, to help one another. He doesn't believe that the strong always eat the weak alive. He thinks that social pressure, and particularly a sense of living under God, can allow people to lead a kind of communal, anarchic life together. So his book, The Kingship of God, is an analysis of those parts of the Bible, particularly the book of Judges, where there is no king in Israel. And of course it's a failure, but Buber says it need not have been a failure. If people had done what they're supposed to do, which is be aware of God, be in relationship with God, it wouldn't have gone so badly. But that's then, this is now, and Buber worked as a Zionist to have a society in the emerging state of Israel that would be made up of small communal settlements, kibbutzim, where people made their own rules together, lived together, and worked together. It's a very romantic, anarchic vision of a society with little politics from the top down, and political order spontaneously coming from the bottom up. And what separates Buber from a secular anarchist is his religiosity. I'll say more about that when we get to Buber in a few minutes. I just want to kind of put him in this grid. Another figure we read who I think is very much in the middle here is Spinoza. For Spinoza, Judaism is not only strongly political, it's only political. For Buber, the whole religious dimension of Judaism is basically an illusion. The most you can get out of the Bible or any religious text is an ethics, morality, and otherwise it's just encoded. All of the ceremonies, the cultic sacrificial system, all of that is just for the sake of politics. And what's the kind of politics that the Bible represents? It's a republican politics. It's politics of shared rule. And again, it doesn't come out that well, it doesn't work that well, because the people were not strong enough to stay together. They allowed divisions to enter in and pull them apart and open themselves to conquest. Somewhere in the middle of this is another figure that we read, Abravanel, the 15th century biblical commentator. in some ways, he certainly rejects monarchy. He certainly accepts a kind of fundamental political dimension of Jewish life. He praises the Republic of Venice, in which he lives. He praises the Republic of Florence. He says that the Bible does not command the Jews to appoint a king. We should read that as a permission, and it's a permission that we should never accept. We should rather rule ourselves in a republican way. But I put him in the middle because he's very much a theocrat. That is, the best republic is the republic in which everyone worships the same God in the same way, and God's power is made manifest through the political life of the people. So he's not as modern as Spinoza is, he's not as cynical as Spinoza is, he's not as secular, if that's not an anachronism, as Spinoza is. He has to be somewhere in the middle. Buber, so maybe this is a good point, a good way to just transition right to Martin Buber. But before I say anything about Buber, is this map, grid, matrix, framework, is this clear? I hope this is helpful.
Very clear.
Okay. I like to, it's clearer than it was, maybe. Yeah, okay. It's as much as one can hope for. There's an old saying, an old story in Japanese Zen Buddhism, where the master says, before Satori, before the experience of nirvana, he says, a mountain is a mountain. He says, after Satori, a mountain is a mountain. So one of his disciples says, well, what's the difference? And he said, the feet are a little higher off the ground. So maybe this helps to get the feet a little higher off the ground, or at least the ideas with a little more clarity. Okay, let's talk about Martin Buber. Have people heard of Buber before? He's pretty well known in Germany, in the United States, in Britain. I guess not as much here. He's well known in that part of the world, not just because Jews, read Martin Buber, but Buber's primary popularity is actually among Christian theologians, particularly Protestants, sometimes Catholics. So his books began to be translated into English by Protestant theologians, and they found his thought very, very appealing and congenial. And then Jews started to read Martin Buber starting in the 1950s, but I think Buber is very well known in the United States because he was adopted by the particularly Protestant theological world, although Catholics have written good books on Buber too. In fact, one of the Jesuits, who was a major theologian at the Jesuit University in New York City, Fordham University, wrote such a good book on Buber that I used to use it as my primary textbook in my class at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Martin Buber's dates are 1878 to 1965. Buber was born in Vienna into an upper middle class, upper bourgeois, cultured, educated family. The great trauma of his life was that his parents divorced when he was 4 years old. This was very, very hard for him. And for the next 10 years, until his teenage years, Buber lived in what the Austrians call Lemberg, and what you call Lviv, right? So, yeah, so Buber spent a decade on the territory of eventually Ukraine. He lived with his grandparents. His grandfather was a disciple of Moses Mendelssohn. He was a representative of the so-called Old Haskalah, that is, very religious man, very traditional, but also a German speaker, a Polish speaker, other languages, and he made the first modern critical editions, scholarly editions of some of the old books of Jewish biblical commentary called Midrash. So Buber was raised in this religious atmosphere. He was very religious through his teenage years in the traditional way. And in that area of Galicia, there were many Hasidic groups, and Buber and his grandfather were not themselves Hasidim, but they lived among Hasidim, and Buber and his grandfather were always visiting them and praying with them and hearing their stories. So Buber started to become known in the decade before the First World War in Germany and the Austrian Empire for writing books of stories of the Hasidim in German. He didn't just translate stories, he kind of reimagined the story and put it not just literally into the language of a modern European, but into the thought world of a modern European. And he used the Hasidic stories from the 18th century, the 19th century that he heard as a way of imagining a world that he himself did not want to join. He couldn't see himself becoming a Hasid, but he did see that world as, in some ways, a much better world than the modern urban industrial capitalist world. That is, Buber was part of a generation before the First World War, reading people like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer and others who were very, very critical of modern civilization. They saw it as sick in some sense, as alienating people from each other. Buber went to university. He started out in Vienna. He went to a number of other universities. He spent a long time in Berlin. He wound up writing a PhD dissertation on medieval Christian mysticism. But one thing that always stayed with Buber is a strong criticism of modern society. He studied with the founders. Okay, I'm going to take this chart off here. Buber studied with some of the founders of modern sociology, and the German sociological tradition, late 19th, early 20th century, drew a strong contrast between, I'm going to give you the German words, forgive me, Gemeinschaft, which means roughly community. Gemein is common, so common, you see. That is something small, something organic, a way of life that's face to face. It's not bureaucratic. There's not structures that drive people in different directions. It's a sort of medieval village kind of ideal, a commune. Later for him, the kibbutz in Israel. He lived actually with his wife in Berlin in a commune. That is, he lived with a number of other people of different religions, all of whom were artists, writers, philosophers. They shared their wealth in common. They did things together. It was an intellectual salon where they stayed up late at night and talked about great ideas. The form of modern society, according to these German sociologists and Buber, that moved beyond Gemeinschaft, that rejected Gemeinschaft, called Gesellschaft. Gesellschaft is more a mass society, a highly structured, institutionalized society, a society governed by bureaucracy. People don't relate to each other face to face any longer. There's anonymity, the anonymity of the subway. In a Gemeinschaft, you share not just a way of life, but you share a way of being, you share a way of thinking about the world, of what life is about, of what your purpose is. The Gesellschaft is isolated, atomized individuals. That's the view. So more like what moderns call society. So Buber's whole fascination with Hasidism, which he begins to translate around 1906, his first Hasidic book comes out. It's looking at their Gemeinschaft, looking at how they have this unique form of community. There is authority. The authority comes from the Rebbe, the rabbinic leader. The Rebbe is charismatic. That is, the Rebbe has some sort of gift directly from God. The people, are very devoted to him. Love binds the Gemeinschaft together. That's what interests him. So he spends his whole life writing about these Hasidim and wondering what they know, what they can teach. If you translate them, what they can teach modern Western people about a better form of communal life.
Just one question. Don't you actually write Gemeinschaft with D? Gemeinschaft.
No, you have Gemeinde, but Gemeinschaft is just Gemeinschaft. So one of Buber's activities early on was, he was very involved in all things Jewish, but one of his activities early on was writing. He was the editor of a journal of sociology and of modern cultural criticism up through the First World War. The other part of Buber's story, which I think is relevant to this, is he is very mystical. That is part of the Hasidic story, this pietist movement that starts in the 18th century. They're mystics. They are often pantheistic. That is, their founder, the Baal Shem Tov, sees God in nature, in everything. They have a mystical theology. Buber is very mystical. He writes his dissertation on, I want to say Meister Eckhart, but that's not. I can't remember the Christian mystic he writes his dissertation on. But his early books, in addition to the Hasidic stuff, they're these kind of mystical rhapsodies about having very intense experiences. And what is an intense mystical experience for Buber? It's an experience of unification, where all of the fractured, fragmented, psychologically split elements of your modern mind, your modern personality, come together in some sort of fusion where you feel whole in the presence of a kind of spiritual force in the universe. The mysticism and the criticism of modern society come together for Buber in the period leading up to the First World War as a kind of positive attitude toward the war. So this is a little hard to accept. Buber feels that the war is a good idea. It's not so much that he's a German patriot or an Austrian patriot. It's that he thinks that a modern society, in order to overcome its lifelessness, its inner divisiveness, its divisions, a modern society needs something in common, something spiritual in common, something that moves people to enthusiasm, sacrifice, dedication. And for Buber, coming together to fight the war against the Allies, that's a very good thing spiritually. Buber has a friend in Berlin who's genuinely an anarchist. Man's name is Gustav Landauer. Landauer thinks that the war is a horrible mistake, that the war shows the corruption of the West, and is very, very critical toward Buber. Buber increasingly comes to doubt his own initial judgment about the war. And Landauer helps Buber to really take a revolutionary position, to make a complete change in his outlook. So, big change for Buber. Comes about a few years after the war, 1923, with the publication of a book in English. They translated it as I and Thou, which is just old-fashioned English for I and you. In the German it's called Ich und Du. This is one of the most famous philosophical religious classics of the 20th century. It's not very long. It's very deep. It's cryptic. It's hard to understand on the surface, but it's a kind of book that immediately grabs you and you want to understand it. Basically what Buber came to believe and what he lays out in I and Thou is he turns away from his earlier mysticism. He doesn't think that what we need any longer, what he was looking in the wrong place. It's not some sort of rare experience that's special, that gives you some sort of feeling or sense that you can't express of God or the absolute or spirit. What we need is true encounter with one another, true meeting, where the word he uses again and again and again is dialogue. And for Buber, coming to full humanity is coming to full humanity in a conversation, in a dialogue with another person. The opposite of I and Thou is what Buber calls I-it. There's an I-you relationship and an I-it relationship. Most of the time we exist with I-it relationships. Even those we love, even those we're very close to, we often don't experience the full measure of their humanity. We treat them as means to an end. We take them for granted. We have superficial interaction with them. They're just the living parts of the furniture of our world. We don't really encounter them. Buber says all real living is encounter or dialogue. And most of the time we're not having that encounter. We're just sort of brushing up against other people. So dialogue is in some ways the most easy, the most obvious, the most natural form of human encounter, but the way we live keeps us in our individual silos, and we don't have these open, honest, vulnerable, exposed encounters with one another. Does the encounter, does the Begegnung, the encounter, have to be verbal? No. It could just be a glance, a look at one another. Two people seeing one another in a crowd, they don't know each other, but they share a look that somehow reveals who they are to one another. That's Begegnung. That's an encounter. Does it have to be, so it doesn't have to be spoken, doesn't have to be verbal. Does it have to be with another human being? No. Buber he talks about his horse when he was growing up on his grandfather's estate in Galicia, and looking into the eyes of the horse, or feeling the horse's heart beating, or smelling the horse, putting his face against the horse's face. He talks about this as this Begegnung, this encounter. Does it have to be with a living thing? No. It can be with a painting. You can have a kind of encounter with the artist in a way through the work that takes the painting out of the everyday it world, the S-Welt, and it can be a living bond between you and this inanimate, non-living thing, but a thing into which spirit has been poured, you can relate to. So, to put the I-thou piece together with the Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft piece, it's only in the Gemeinschaft, in the small society, where we really have the greatest possibility of I-thou encounter, and where our I becomes the I and thou, not the I of I and it. For Buber, there's no such thing as a stable ego, a stable I. It's always a dependent variable on the relationship, the type of relationship it's part of. So let me wrap this around now to Buber's Jewish thought, and particularly his political Jewish thought. I used to teach a 15-week course on Martin Buber, so I'm actually prepared to go to early September here, but probably have other plans, and I have a plane to catch tomorrow morning, so I'll try to be brief. From the 1890s on, Martin Buber works closely with Theodor Herzl. Martin Buber becomes a Zionist. He edits the Journal of the Zionist Movement. Herzl saw him as a rising young talent, and Buber eventually parts ways with Theodor Herzl, who dies in 1904, and Buber sort of pulls out of the mainstream Zionist movement, and he comes in and out because of his own peculiar kind of teaching. Buber wants Jews to renew themselves as a people, to get out from under modern Western civilization. He wants exactly the opposite of what Moses Mendelssohn wanted at his side of history. Jews are already emancipated, but it's killing Judaism, he thinks. Jews need to reinvent themselves, and they need to discover the hidden sources of their life. what he means by those hidden sources changes over time as he goes from his mystical period to his dialogue period. But what he wants all along is Jewish settlement in the land of Israel, but he doesn't necessarily want a Jewish state there. He distrusts politics. In his mature thought, he wants Jews to live in small self-governing communities like the kibbutz, where people share everything in common, work together. He envisions a future Israel to be something like Belgium or Switzerland. You could say Bosnia-Herzegovina, but it doesn't really work. Switzerland works, really well. That is, people living, Jews and Arabs living in their own cantons, under their own local government, and having some kinds of agreements. But it's not top-down, it's always bottom-up. Buber and his group, who founded the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, were advocates of what they called a bi-national state. That is, it shouldn't be a Jewish state, it shouldn't be an Arab state, it shouldn't be a secular state, it should be a free country in which people live in their own groups or in shared groups if they want, and the authority comes from the ground up. So there's a kind of Zionism that might have had an opportunity at one point, but of course didn't work out that way. Now, for Buber, this would be the modern equivalent of ancient theocracy. Buber praises the concept of theocracy, that is, direct rule by God. Let's take a look at the selection from Buber. It's just one paragraph. It's a book that came out in 1932, if I remember correctly. It's called Das Königtum Gottes, the Kingship of God. And it's a study, on one side, it's a study of the book of Judges, and in general of the idea in the Bible that the ideal of the Bible is not kingship, but the direct rule of God. How it was possible in the Bible, how it went wrong. On the other hand, this book is an argument for how we could try to implement theocracy today. Now, let me be careful. When we use the word theocracy, I don't know how it is in Ukrainian or Russian, but when you say theocracy in English, you don't think about the sort of thing that Buber is proposing. What comes to mind is Iran. Something like Iran. And that is not what Buber means. The proper term for Iran's form of government would be a hierocracy. That is the rule of a priestly caste, a group of ritual specialists in Iran, the imams, the high imams, the ayatollahs. That is theocracy gone bad. Buber, as a religious anarchist, socialist as well, he envisions this spontaneous order of people on a local level who all share this encounter with the divine. For him, and I and thou, God is at the heart of any society. Every you encounter that you have with another human being ultimately is an encounter with God. So when theocracy fails, when it cools down, when it goes bad, some group of people claiming to speak for God or rule in God's place, they take over. So that's for Buber not what he has in mind. So in this book, The Kingship of God, he's trying to argue on the basis of his reading of the Bible for pure theocracy being the best form of politics for ancient Israel, and this is a view that we can continue to develop and actually practice today. And how would we practice it today in a secular age? Basically through this sort of religiously oriented anarchism, having as little government as possible, having sort of thin, weak states on top and rich, thick, communal life below. It's very utopian. Let's just take a look at the paragraph from The Kingship of God. It's a very clear statement on Buber's part of the political nature of the Bible. He, meaning God, the divine king, is not content to be God in the religious sense. He does not want to surrender to a man that which is not God's, the rule over the entire actuality of worldly life. This very rule he lays claim to and enters upon it, for there is nothing which is not God's. So God will not settle for anything less than everything. There's no area of human life, of nature, of the cosmos, which is not God's, not in relationship to God. He will apportion, he will give to the one forever and ever chosen by him his tasks, but naked power without a situationally related task he does not wish to bestow. Oh, this is Buber's kind of very convoluted Germanic way of saying that God doesn't establish political structures. God is not going to just endorse a dynasty, although in the Bible God does endorse a dynasty. But a relationship with God is a calling. God imposes a task on a person, and the person has to respond in that hour in a unique way. It's worth pointing out about Buber that although he was deeply religious in his I and thou, very idiosyncratic, very radical way, he was deeply antagonistic toward rabbinic Judaism. He was completely opposed to the inherited Judaism of the rabbis. To let that sink in for a minute. He was not only completely opposed to the inherited Judaism of the rabbis, the very thing that the Hasidim practiced, but he was opposed to law. He was opposed to ethics. Anything that you can structure into an institutionalized system of rules or principles or values, anything with stability over time, gets in the way of the spontaneity of encounter, of dialogue, and here of hearing the task that's given you by God in the moment.
I have a question about the task. What does Buber mean when he says he will appoint to the one forever and ever chosen by him? Does he mean Davidic dynasty or some kind of a king? One might say it's like a Jesus allusion to, or what is this?
Well, I don't remember the exact context from which I extracted this paragraph, but for Buber to be chosen by God is not a permanent affair.
This is forever and ever.
Yeah, I think that's kind of his poetic expression. I don't think Buber believes that the Davidic dynasty has some kind of permanent lock on chosenness by God. That is a fantasy of the biblical authors. Buber is a critical Bible scholar. So he uses the language of the Bible, uses the critical apparatus of university-trained Bible scholars, but his own religious thought, which is what I'm trying to get out here, which is what, drives the whole project. It's against his religious thought to see any permanence to a relationship in politics. What there is moment-by-moment response to the divine presence. I think what he means is that there's only chosenness if there's response to the situation that's given to by God. One of the themes of his biblical scholarship is that all true biblical leaders are failed leaders. There's no such thing as political success in the Bible. He says, he makes known his will first of all as constitution, not constitution of cult and custom only, also economy and society. He'll proclaim it again and again. In the last sentence in italics, the separation of religion and politics, which stretches through history, is here overcome in real paradox. Okay. So for Buber, there can be no separation between religion and politics. A good politics is a theocratic politics that responds in a living way to the presence, the word, the tasks imposed by God. And a good religion is a religion that is aware of the needs of the hour, of what needs to be done, and isn't locked into some sort of old ritual and traditional mentality that refuses to be in a living present. One of the last things that Martin Buber wrote, he made several trips to the United States, and he gave a talk at Carnegie Hall, a great concert venue in New York City, and it was called Hope for Our Time. And he actually was a meditation about how the world is trapped between the West and the Soviet Union. And we are incapable of simply meeting one another and discovering one another as human beings. We're sort of locked into a false consciousness of our own ideological systems, where nothing that the other on the other side of the wall says can be believed, can be taken as a human expression. It has to be seen through the blinders of ideological politics. And tries to talk about how we can only have hope if we can overcome ideology and make some way to find humanity. It's kind of a nice essay. Okay, so let's say a few words about Yeshayahu Leibovitz. Leibovitz dates are 1903 to 1994. So he lived to a ripe old age, 91 years old. He was from Latvia. He was trained as a chemist. He was also trained as a medical doctor. He was a professor of chemistry at the Hebrew University. He was a highly Orthodox Jew. So he was an original theologian, an Orthodox Jew, an original theologian, and a completely secular Zionist. Yeshayahu Leibovitz has this very powerful, quite unique theology that contemporary Jewish theologians and philosophers study. I'll tell you some of it in a few minutes. But one thing that he was absolutely convinced of is that the state of Israel, as a modern state, is a purely secular phenomenon. It has no religious significance whatsoever. It has nothing to do with Judaism. It should not be confused with Judaism. That whole movement of religious Zionism, particularly as it got weaponized after 1967 at the hands of Tzvi Yehuda Kook, Gush Emunim, and these people who see the conquest of the territories as part of a divine process of salvation. He thinks that's all insanity. He thinks it's idolatry. Judaism is far removed from any kind of politics. Okay, so to understand, so he made in the piece that I gave you by him, just a few paragraphs from one of his essays, he tells us that he thinks the state of Israel has accomplished everything it set out to do. It has no religious significance, and its significance is simply being a working state that has democratic governance, that keeps people safe, allows people to live their lives. That's all you want out of politics. It has no further significance than that. Nothing the state of Israel does has religious significance in the slightest, and people who think it has religious significance, who think this is the Atchalta de Geulta, the beginning of redemption, they're actually sinning. That is the worship of something other than God. He's very, very strict about this. And his criticisms of the behavior of Israel, sometimes in war, the religious Zionists and what they find in the state of Israel in terms of divine significance. He got very, very extreme. His remarks sound often extremely anti-Zionist, very harsh. He sometimes compared Israelis to Nazis. I mean, he was just very, very, very extreme. And yet he was a Zionist in a fully secular way and a very radical Orthodox Jew at the same time. So he's a very interesting character. Some people can't stand him. They don't like him at all. They don't like his outlook. They don't forgive him for the way he spoke. Other people write PhD dissertations on him because they think he's so brilliant. A colleague of mine did a lot of work with his sister. And some of you, particularly in Jewish studies, might have heard of his sister, Nechama Leibovitz. Nechama Leibovitz wrote all of these wonderful books on the Bible, where she interprets the chapters of the Bible using medieval and ancient materials, and they're really, really nice. They're very rich. They're very, very humane. Always quite brilliant. And my colleague Walter told me that she once said about her brother Yeshayahu, she said, he always takes things too far. He always goes to extremes. So as I present his thought very, very briefly now, you can see how I think he takes things to extreme. So Leibovitz has theologically this very strong view that Judaism should not be thought of as a religion, in a sense. Religion is human beings seeking spiritual fulfillment. Religion is human beings trying to find their way to worship God, or to be together in community, or to take on special practices that give them a sense of communion with the deity, or purpose in the world. Religion is full of psychological and sociological motivations. Religion is about seeking, sometimes finding. It serves human needs. For Leibovitz, anything that serves human needs cannot be holy. If we use the word religion at all, we just prefer to use the word Torah. It is about serving God. That's it. You get no benefit whatsoever from serving God. You can't say anything about heaven. There's no pie in the sky when you die. You're not making the world a better place. No. It is the pure, disinterested service of God. In Hebrew, you say, he uses the word lishma, for its own sake. The mitzvot, the commandments, are not good for anything. You don't practice the mitzvot to become a more sensitive person. Even the Talmud says they're for the refinement of the midot, of one's moral qualities. Nonsense, Leibovitz says. If you use the mitzvot for something, you are not serving God, you are serving man. And that is idolatry. Yeah, I mean, you can see how you don't serve the state, you don't glorify the state, it's purely transactional. So, for him, Judaism is not religion, it's halakha. Law is faith for the Jews. There's this system of commandments. That's it. That's unique. If you use the word religion, you're comparing Judaism to other religions. You know, you think that religion is a genus, and then there are these species, Buddhism, Confucianism, Judaism. No, that's the wrong way of thinking about it. All of that is human. The halakha is given by God. So it's a very, very narrow, very intense sense of what Jewish faith is. It's simply the performance of mitzvot as an end in themselves, with the pure worship of God in mind, doing it only for God's sake, expecting absolutely no benefit, having a pure sense of duty in response to the will of God in halakha. Has nothing to do with nature, has nothing to do with history, has nothing to do with politics. Does it have anything to do with belief? No. For Leibovitz, there's no such thing as Jewish belief. Well, the Torah has stories, like the first verse, Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Should we believe that? Leibovitz says, no, it's not. It's not important. It's not important. We have science. He's a scientist. He makes his living teaching chemistry. Judaism is not about the world. It's about the pure worship of God and the halakha. So if you say, how did the universe get here? Well, a traditional Jew would say, Maseh Bereshit, God created it. He said, we can't know that. That's irrelevant. Science gives us robust, sufficient, empirical answers to many questions. As science develops, it'll give us answers to more questions. So the Torah is not a source of information about the world. It doesn't tell us anything about the future. It doesn't tell us anything about metaphysics. It's irrelevant. He's very modern, like Spinoza or like Mendelssohn in that sense. There are no Jewish beliefs. The Torah doesn't tell us anything about history. Maybe it says things about the ancient Israelites in biblical times. It's not important. That has no purpose. It's all halakha and obedience. What about these times? Is the Torah is reading the prophets, for example, as so many Protestant Christian groups and some Jews do, as a sort of, report on what's happening now. what's God doing in the world and what's going to come. That's nonsense. He says that there's history, there's a science of history. If you want to know what happened in the world, you do historical research. You don't read the Torah, you don't speculate about the prophets. Yep, this is how he thinks. So one more important piece of Leibovitz, and that is this Torah that is Judaism, this halakha that Jews ought to practice as an end in itself if they want to serve God. It's limited. It is not a Torah that has to do with the constitution of a state. It cannot carry that load. There is no way you could have a state governed according to the laws of the Torah. Unlike Isaac Breuer, who thought that you could have such a modern state. Oh, I forgot to put Breuer on my chart. Put Breuer under monarchy if you want to include him. Straddling the line between republic and monarchy, because Breuer wanted to have a state governed by the Torah without yet a king, eventually a messianic king, but we don't need one now. We can have a Torah republic. Leibovitz thinks that's insane. He doesn't think that the Torah is in any way capable of governing a state. We shouldn't think such a crazy thought. And therefore, you need modern political principles. You need modern political technology, teaching, constitutionalism in order to have a state. That's another reason why the state has nothing to do with religion. The example that I use, which makes more sense in an American context than here, is maybe some of you might have heard of this great figure in the 17th century, Roger Williams. Roger Williams was a Puritan Protestant friend of the great John Milton, the English author. Roger Williams comes to Massachusetts Bay Colony to settle. They kick him out because his views are too heretical. And Roger Williams settles along the shores of Narragansett Bay. In the colony he called Rhode Island, my home state. And Roger Williams has this, he's a theologian, he has this radical doctrine of toleration. He rejects Puritanism, this idea that you can have religion and state theocratically bound up together. Roger Williams believes that the church is so holy, the state has nothing to do with religion. The state takes care of defense and civil law, criminal law, but it can't touch religion, and the consequence of that is people should have absolute liberty to practice any religion they want. It's not the business of the state. The holiness of the church can only be the case because the world is not holy. So the world should be not damned, but the world should be left alone by religion, and people should live the way they want in the world as long as they're peaceful. So he invited Turks and Jews and all other Christians to come live in his capital city of Providence, Rhode Island, my hometown. Leibovitz has a very similar view in a way, because his view is based on a concept of holiness and the opposite of holiness. And halakha is so holy, it doesn't have anything to do with the world. It just has to do with God. So I think he's important not only as an original theologian, but because he's a great counterweight to so much of the religion-politics nexus, religion-politics connection in contemporary Israel. It's gone in a completely different direction. I think a much more dangerous direction than Dr. Leibovitz. Okay, the last piece I handed out just today, if you haven't. It's the English summary of this longish Hebrew article. Is a halachic state possible? The paradox of Jewish theocracy. We don't have time to read it, but I'll just summarize what Ravitsky is doing. Ravitsky's trying to take a position, I'd say, that doesn't identify with Leibovitz on the one hand, and doesn't identify with a theocrat like Buber on the other, or Breuer, that is, a theocrat who wants the halakha to be the law of the state. Ravitsky's view is a very sane view. He says that Judaism is very much a political religion. It's what Spinoza called a theopolitics. The anti-political conception of Judaism is a late 18th, 19th century adaptation to the West. It's not the original Jewish view coming out of the Bible. But his argument, unlike, say, Buber's, is that the Bible is very realistic about human beings. It's anti-utopian. It sees human beings in a sort of Hobbesian way as being totally self-interested, dangerous animals who are fundamentally lawless, who need to be governed rather strongly to keep their bad tendencies in check. The primary purpose of a state in Jewish law, Ravitsky argues, is not, as Maimonides, I keep pointing to people who aren't there any longer, but the primary purpose is not, as Maimonides would have it, to elevate people, to refine human nature, to have a kind of world of virtue, as Aristotle and Plato wanted from their politics. No, the primary purpose of politics is to give people order and enough structure and liberty so that they can live their lives and follow the good in common as best they can. Therefore, what Judaism expects from politics is not anything overtly religious, it's practical. Judaism is very pragmatic about politics, he says. Judaism envisions theocracy, but it also knows that theocracy doesn't work, and therefore the drive, particularly in the Middle Ages, is toward a more minimal, practical, political vision in which the Jewish community can live religiously and pursue the ultimate good in that way. But the politics is just a sort of safe space in which the community can realize the ultimate good. It is not itself the ultimate good. So with that conception in mind, Abiezer Ravitsky says that there are important reasons why a halachic state is not possible. It's not possible on any good internal reading of the halakha. As Leibovitz says, it's just not rich enough. There's not enough there to really have a fully functioning state. You'd have to go way beyond the halakha to get that. That's why Maimonides and others want a king with a lot of liberty and discretion. But in order for a state to be functional, to really take care of its citizens, to be strong, the citizens need to accept it, accept its legitimacy. And the state of Israel has a majority secular population. They would never accept the justice of a halachic state. Even if the halakha were up to the challenge of governing a state, the people would never think that that's a good idea. So any proposal for a halakhic state would fail the first test of a functional politics, that is, popular legitimacy. So, on the other hand, he doesn't think, like Leibovitz, that the state should be completely secular. He says The Jewish state is to some large extent the state of the Jews. The Jews, even if many of them are secular, have a tradition. They're a unique kind of people, and the state should reflect the broad religious-based culture of the Jewish people within democratic norms and limits. So he doesn't see a version of Israel as like the United States, where you have a separation of church and state. He thinks Shabbat, for example, there should be laws in the state of Israel that prevent, bus traffic on Shabbat if a city wants to do it that way. So it's a kind of centrist position between a religious extreme and an anti-religious extreme, and that, I think, pretty much brings us up to the present day. Levitsky wrote this essay. It came out in 2006 or 7 or so. 2004. 2004. Okay, well, that is a very quick tour of philosophical thought about religion and politics in some of the leading modern Jewish thinkers, with help from the ancient sources on which Judaism draws. I don't know if this is what you were looking for in this course, but this is what you got, and I hope you enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.